Is democracy truly the rule of the people, or is it the rule of a hidden few? Have you ever wondered if your mind is enslaved by a system designed to keep you blind? What if everything you've been taught about democracy is a lie, to maintain control? No one can imagine that the very freedoms they cherish are shackles in disguise. Farrakhan recently said that the architects of democracy never intended for you to be free. The democratic system is a tool for mass mental enslavement. But how is it possible that democracy, the so-called savior of nations, is nothing more than a prison for your thoughts? Let's find out. Is democracy really about freedom, or is it a system designed to control the masses? For centuries, democracy has been heralded as the gold standard of governance. In schools, we're taught that the most fair, just, and equitable system gives people the power to shape their future. But beneath the surface, democracy is anything but a system of freedom. It is a well-oiled machine designed to create the illusion of control, while the real power remains in the hands of the few. To understand how this illusion works, we must first examine the origins of democracy. While the word itself comes from the ancient Greek words demos, the people, and kratos, power or rule, the system of governance it describes has always been exclusive. The ancient Athenian democracy, often considered the birthplace of the democratic system, was highly restrictive. Only a small portion of the population, free, land-owning men, were allowed to participate. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded, as they were seen as inferior and unworthy of political power. Today's democracy, although more inclusive on paper, functions similarly. Citizens are given the right to vote, but the choices they make are heavily influenced by powerful interests. From campaign funding by corporations to media manipulation, voters are steered towards selecting candidates who align with the interests of the elites. This isn't a true representation of the people's will. It's a carefully crafted system that keeps the same groups in power, generation after generation. Let's take the United States as a case study, a nation that prides itself on being the beacon of democracy. In every election cycle, millions of dollars are spent by corporate lobbyists, special interest groups, and wealthy donors to ensure that their preferred candidates come out on top. The cost of running a successful presidential campaign has skyrocketed over the past few decades, making it nearly impossible for anyone without connections to wealth and power to run for office. Does that sound like a government that serves the people?
You really want democracy? Let me break it down and show you what it means. You want democracy? You got democracy.
Beyond the manipulation of elections, democracy is often upheld by deeply flawed systems of representation. In most democracies, elected officials do not truly represent their constituents' needs and desires. Instead, they act as intermediaries between the people and the powerful corporations and institutions that fund their campaigns. Laws are passed, not because they benefit the people, but because they protect the interests of the wealthy. Take, for example, the U.S. tax system. Despite calls for tax reforms that benefit the middle and lower classes, wealthy individuals and corporations continue to receive tax breaks, loopholes, and subsidies, all thanks to their cozy relationships with elected officials. Even in countries that claim to have direct representation, like Switzerland with its frequent referenda, voter turnout is often dismally low, and the issues on the table are shaped by media narratives controlled by the elite. The common people may be allowed to vote on key issues, but they're voting within a framework built by the rich and powerful. In essence, they are choosing from options that have already been vetted and approved by those at the top. If democracy is a system designed to keep the people in line, then who's calling the shots? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Let's be blunt, it's not the politicians. The real power in any modern democracy lies in the control of the money supply. And in the United States and many other countries, that control is in the hands of central banks like the Federal Reserve. But here's something that might shock you. The Federal Reserve isn't part of the government. It's a private entity, run by a small group of elites who have the power to control the entire economy without any direct accountability to the public. Established in 1913, the Federal Reserve was created after a secretive meeting between some of the wealthiest men in America on Jekyll Island. Their goal? To create a banking system that would allow them to control the money supply and manipulate the economy for their benefit. By controlling interest rates, inflation, and the availability of credit, the Federal Reserve has more influence over the everyday lives of Americans than any elected official. When the Fed decides to raise interest rates, borrowing becomes more expensive, which affects everything from housing prices to job creation. When it prints more money, inflation rises, which erodes the purchasing power of ordinary citizens. Yet these decisions are made behind closed doors, with little input from the public. The Fed is an unelected body that holds immense power over the economy, and by extension, over the lives of millions of people. Think about it. Who benefits when the Fed prints money?
You need to get a book that details how the Federal Reserve Bank came into existence. The boys that print your money, that's the real power. And they got us killing each other over this. Selling out our future over this.
It's not the average worker. It's the banks, the corporations, and the investors who see their assets inflate in value, while the middle class struggles to keep up with rising costs. In fact, the Federal Reserve's actions often lead to economic bubbles, such as the housing bubble that triggered the 2008 financial crisis. And when those bubbles burst, it's the working class people who lose their jobs, their homes, and their savings, while the wealthy are bailed out by the government. The relationship between the Federal Reserve and democracy is one of the greatest deceptions of our time. We are told that we live in a system where the people have power, but in reality, our economic future is dictated by an institution that operates in secrecy and serves the interests of the financial elite. Democracy becomes a facade when the true levers of power are controlled by unelected, unaccountable institutions like the Fed. If the Federal Reserve holds such immense power over our economy and democracy, how is this tied to the larger history of global control? Slavery, as most people think of it, ended in the 19th century. But the truth is, slavery has evolved. Physical chains may have been broken, but mental and financial chains remain. Debt, economic dependency, and systemic inequality are the new shackles that bind millions of people worldwide. To understand this concept, we need to recognize the parallels between the transatlantic slave trade and today's financial system. In the past, people were physically bound and forced to work for their masters, enriching the elite class while the slaves lived in abject poverty. Today, many people are bound by debt, working endlessly to pay off loans, mortgages, and credit cards, while the financial institutions that created these debts grow wealthier. Consider student loans as a modern example. In countries like the United States, students are told that a college education is the key to success. But in reality, many graduates leave school with tens of thousands of dollars in debt, only to find that the job market doesn't offer the opportunities they were promised. They spend the next several decades working to pay off that debt, all the while accumulating interest. The system is designed to keep them in perpetual financial bondage. This system of financial enslavement has its roots in the same forces that profited from the transatlantic slave trade. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European and American financiers played a significant role in funding and organizing the slave trade. Banks and insurance companies in cities like London, Liverpool, and New York grew rich by insuring slave ships, financing plantation owners, and investing in the infrastructure that made the trade possible.
That's the way America sees herself. She's destroyed nations, but no nation has bombed her. Not one of America's cities has suffered what America has put on cities of nations around this world. You that visit America, you can fly from the East Coast to the West Coast. You see an unbroken string of marvelous cities and towns that have never known the ravages of war. Not from the outside. It only knew war in the Civil War, in the War of 1812. And those were wars, but not since America has been developed.
Today, those same financial institutions, now operating under different names, continue to exploit marginalized communities. In the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, millions of people lost their homes due to predatory lending practices by major banks. These institutions targeted low-income families, often from minority communities, offering them subprime mortgages with high interest rates that they could never hope to repay. When the bubble burst, these families were left homeless, while the banks were bailed out by the government. In this way, modern financial institutions have become the new slave masters, keeping people in a state of economic servitude through debt, poverty, and systemic inequality. The tools may have changed, but the underlying power dynamics remain the same. Now let's come to Africa. Is democracy really helping Africa, or is it a tool being used to keep us in chains?
Well, demos krates and democracy means the rule not of the people, but the rule of the devil. Democracy. So when they say, we want democracy in Africa, we want the rule of the devil, not the rule of the people. They have never wanted the rule of the people.
Africa is often portrayed as a continent in need of saving by the West. Western nations and international organizations like the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund (IMF) promote democracy as the key to Africa's development. But behind this facade of goodwill lies a darker truth. Democracy, as it's being imposed on Africa, is just another form of control. Since the end of colonialism, African nations have struggled to build their own systems of governance. But every time a country tries to break free from Western influence, it faces economic sanctions, political destabilization, and, in some cases, outright military intervention. The West uses democracy as a weapon, pushing African countries to adopt political systems that serve Western interests rather than the interests of the African people. Take, for example, the role of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These institutions offer loans to African nations, but with strict conditions attached. Countries are forced to implement austerity measures, privatize public services, and open up their markets to foreign corporations. These policies often lead to widespread poverty, as essential services like healthcare and education become inaccessible to the poor. Meanwhile, foreign corporations swoop in to exploit Africa's natural resources, leaving little for the local population. Even worse, when African leaders try to resist these measures, they are often labeled as dictators or human rights abusers. The West then uses this narrative to justify regime change, either through economic pressure or direct intervention. This has happened time and time again, from Libya to Zimbabwe to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Western powers install puppet governments that are willing to play by their rules, ensuring that Africa remains a source of cheap labor and raw materials. But democracy, as it's been sold to Africa, is not the answer. It's a system designed to keep African nations dependent on Western aid, loans, and approval. The true path to freedom lies in rejecting the Western model of governance and creating systems that reflect Africa's unique cultural and historical context.
They want the rule of a few to subjugate the masses so that the few can live in luxury as bloodsuckers of the poor. Democracy. It's the only game in town now. Democracy. And like it's written, I think in the book of Jeremiah, Mr. Bush can say, as it's written there, I sit as a queen and shall see no sorrow.
If democracy is being used as a weapon to control African nations, what can we do to break free? The first step in breaking free from the cycle of control is recognizing the illusion for what it is. Africa doesn't need Western-style democracy to succeed. It needs systems that are tailored to the continent's diverse cultures, histories, and values. This means rejecting the loans and aid packages that come with strings attached. Africa is rich in natural resources, and those resources should be used to benefit the African people, not foreign corporations. By taking control of its own economy, Africa can build a future where prosperity is shared and wealth remains in the hands of the people. This also means investing in education, healthcare, and infrastructure, not through foreign loans, but through the wealth that Africa already possesses. Countries like Botswana have shown that it is possible to use natural resources, such as diamonds, to build a thriving economy without falling into the debt trap set by the West. Botswana has one of the highest levels of economic growth in Africa, thanks to its careful management of its resources and its commitment to self-sufficiency. At the same time, African nations must reject the cultural and religious impositions that have been forced upon them. For too long, Africa has been told that it must adopt Western values and systems of governance in order to be modern. But Africa's strength lies in its diversity. It's time for African nations to reclaim their cultural heritage, their spiritual traditions, and their political independence. This isn't about rejecting progress. It's about rejecting a system that was never meant to serve us. The West's version of democracy is not the only way, and it's certainly not the best way for Africa. It's time for African nations to create systems that work for them, not against them. Now that you know the truth, can you continue believing in democracy as it's been sold to you? Are you still convinced that your mind is free, or have you realized the chains that bind your thoughts? Let us know in the comment section. After seeing the manipulation behind the system, do you still trust those who promote democracy as a path to liberation? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.